Well, let's talk about that right now with my next guest. Brendan Chilton is a Labour councillor. He's also a former chair of Labour Leave, campaigning for Brexit. He's also chief executive of the Independent Business Network. And with all of those hats on, so much to talk about. Good afternoon to you, Brendan.
Good afternoon, Julia. I have to have many disguises, you see.
What do you know about me today? Look, I just want to talk just first of all on that issue about bringing in new laws. The urge for this government, the hate crime laws, they're in favour of the smoking laws coming in. I mean, I would say as bad as, if not worse than, the last few Tory governments we've had in terms of just wanting to control people's lives. You're a Labour councillor. I mean, what is it about Labour and the urge to, ban things, control people and all of that?
Well, unfortunately, we have this sort of tradition or disease in this country where governments, Tory and Labour, but perhaps slightly more so Labour governments, feel they can pull a lever in Westminster, namely pass a law, and it have an immediate impact across the country. Of course, things like the smoking ban have reduced smoking and other public health measures too. But I'm a great libertarian. I think people should be able to make their own choices on their own health and face the consequences of those choices. If you smoke 100 fags a day, the chances are you will end up with some sort of lung problem. If you drink 2 bottles of whiskey a day, not that I have any knowledge of that sort of thing,
quickly.
You'll end up with severe liver trouble, etc. But we shouldn't feel as though we should restrict people. We can educate, we can inform, but the idea that you should just outright ban something, all you do is push it on the black market. And I can tell you, go around any estate in England and you will find teenagers and young people scooting about on bikes, dealing on behalf of bigger dealers further up the chain. I agree with what your commentator was saying just there. It would be far better to enforce the laws we have, scrap all these bans, scrap all these unnecessary extra pieces of legislation and just go back to basics and enforce what we have.
Yeah, that seems very simple. Of course, it's very difficult for us to enforce the law when we don't have anywhere to put people if they do actually get prosecuted and get convicted. I mean, very few people do get arrested, very few people get prosecuted, very few people actually end up getting convicted and going to prison. But we found out that we had fewer than 100 spaces left in male prisons by last night. We've seen a spate of people imprisoned as a result of those Southport riots. Many of those I thoroughly endorse those people going to prison for acts of violence and incitement. But some of those people, I think, for tweets and Facebook posts, no, I don't think they have any business being behind bars. But I mean, when Keir Starmer says that he was sitting in the Cobra room, basically deciding what to do during those riots and having to find out how many prison spaces there were, do we have any hope that he, as a former director of public prosecutions, is going to deal with this issue by the simple process of building more prisons? Because letting people out after just 40% of their sentence, which is what's going to start happening next month, and with even more violent and sex offender criminals coming out the month after, I'm not sure is the solution that the British people want.
No, I think that first of all, there is clearly a long-term issue with prison capacity. And I don't want to be unnecessarily political, but that is part of the planning failures of the previous government. This government isn't going to solve that anytime soon. I think one of the big issues, and I'm not a softie on law and order, Julia, as you know, one of the things I think takes up a lot of space in prison is very short sentences. There are quite a few people in prison that are sentenced there for 2 to 3 months. Now, of course, people need to be punished for crimes they do. But if you're going to fill up a prison cell for 2 to 3 months, ongoing with various small crimes, that does create an issue in terms of the number of people you can put in for more serious crimes. So that does need to be addressed, and whether we have sort of more community sentencing or financial penalties instead of shorter sentences, perhaps the government can look at that. I do agree with you that locking up people for opinions that they express on social media that might offend people, frankly, is ridiculous. Nobody in this country has the right not to be offended, in my opinion.
Well, except that apparently they do, with the explosion of non-crime hate incidents we've seen. Let me ask you about the substance of what Keir Starmer had to say yesterday in terms of tax. But first, I want to talk to you as a former chairman of Labour Leave, a keen campaigner for Brexit. When Keir Starmer says it's time to turn a corner on Brexit, reset Britain's relationship with the EU, in this press conference with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, this morning, he said, this doesn't mean turning back on Brexit. An awful lot of people are getting in touch on the phone lines here and on text and tweets saying they don't trust trust him an inch. He spent 3 years, 2016 to 2019, as Shadow Brexit Secretary under Jeremy Corbyn, trying to undermine Brexit, trying to orchestrate there to be a second referendum to stop the first referendum being enacted. Can we trust Keir Starmer as far as we can throw him when it comes to Brexit?
Well, I would just say if there is any attempt to take us back into the European Union, single market or customs union, I shall do my best to stop it. But I think in terms of the UK having a trade relationship that's stronger with Europe's largest economy, Germany, I think that's advantageous. For me, Brexit was about us being outside of the European Union and able to strike bilateral deals. We obviously need to see the detail of what's proposed between the UK and Germany, but if that makes it easier for German businesses to invest in the UK and British businesses to do deals with Germany, I've got no problem with that.
Wait a minute, how can Britain do a deal with Germany? I thought the whole point we kept being told we can't do deals with anybody because we're inside the EU and Brussels makes those deals on our behalf with our input. So how can Germany inside the EU do a deal with us?
Well,
unless the EU agree with it.
Well, this is where we need to get into the detail of what's on that deal. So, for example, Keir has gone there today to say he wants to deal with Germany, but attached to that, we are seeing commentary around easier access for young people across Europe and things like that. So, again, we've got to wait for the meat, if you like, on this to be fleshed out. If it is a bilateral arrangement, again, I would be interested to see how that happens. If we can do it, let's do it. Attached to this, of course, is the Defence Pact. And the concern I have there, of course, is while we need to cooperate individually with nations in Europe on defence, we do not want to see any watering down of NATO, because it is NATO that is our primary defence alliance, rather than moving towards some sort of European model. Of course, if President Trump wins in the autumn, we will need to examine NATO because he has some very firm views on that. But our primary defence arrangement is NATO. Yeah. I hope Labour stick to the commitment not to take us back into the EU, because the one thing not many people are covering is that reform are biting at Labour's heels in many, many constituencies up and down this country, and they're not going anywhere. And if we renege on our commitments on Brexit, we will face the price of doing that at the next election.
Indeed, it was many poorer Labour voting constituencies in the Midlands and the North which were so keen on Brexit because they knew the economic impact on them. Well, let's talk about the economic impact of what Keir Starmer has been announcing as well, in terms of, basically how bad things are. The country's in a terrible state. It's worse than they thought. There's whatever it is. Well, I mean, what is it? £100 billion black hole this week? I mean, it changes every week, doesn't it? But saying, look, we haven't got any choice. There's going to have to be tax rises. Now, he's promised in the election no tax rises, no for income tax, for national insurance, for VAT. Now, of course, that is the tax rates. We're now pretty sure on national insurance it's the employee tax rate on national insurance, not employer. People talking about inheritance tax, capital gains tax, tax on pensions, and employer national insurance as some of the many taxes that could be put up. You're chief executive of the Independent Business Network. What damage is that going to do to the economy? Can you literally tax your way out of the economic doldrums into prosperity and growth?
Yeah, the short answer, Julia, is no, you can't. And both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer said when in opposition that Britain is a high tax economy, and as a consequence, we are a low growth economy. At the moment, we are seeing, well, under the last government, we lost out on investments such as the Pfizer factory because we had higher rates of corporation tax in this country. If we put them up any further, we'll be one of the highest in the G7 and the G20. Ireland's got a rate of 12%. The EU average is 21%. So if you've got outlier United Kingdom currently sitting at 24 or potentially going up, that will not be good for inward investment. In terms of their commitments on income tax and VAT, they have therefore somewhat boxed themselves into a corner because they are one of the primary areas where governments collect their revenue. Yeah. I think obviously we're going to have to wait and see what Rachel Reeves comes out with. But the short message here is a high tax economy is a low growth economy. You dissuade investment, and there's no incentive for individuals to work harder to earn more because they're going to be penalised more because they're paying more tax.
And especially with independent businesses, and a lot of people, when you set up a business, I know people, they set up businesses, they didn't pay themselves for the first 6 months, they scrape by, business gets successful, and yet they sell it now. Whether or not they get rid of entrepreneurs relief or not on capital gains tax, that would just be insane. You're basically saying to people, don't bother trying to create a business and create jobs. But people forget, we talk all the time about the CBI and these big businesses, the high street names. They don't employ the vast majority of people in this country. Most people in this country are employed by small to medium-sized companies, often started as a family business or just an individual, and they've grown with success. We cannot be penalising those people. They are the backbone of our economic success, aren't they?
They are indeed, and it's not just a question of tax as well. These huge companies have huge administrative and HR departments to deal with the annual economic, social and environmental reports that have now got to be written by every company in this country. They've got huge tax offices that make sure they pay as very little as possible. They've got, as I said, big HR departments that can deal with payroll issues. A small firm where you may have a sole trader that subcontracts out to 1 or 2 people, or a small business employing 3 or 4 in a yard, they do not have the luxury of all those extras in their business, and they have to do it themselves. And you find so many, particularly small businesses, don't really last because they're just frankly exhausted having to do all these extra things on their own. Oh, and by the way, cough up a bit more money for the Treasury. If we want this country to grow, and the government have said then their national mission is delivering economic growth, there are some very simple things we need to do. For 1 regulation in, get rid of 2. Reduce taxes on the small startups and the self-employed, energy security, and incentivise investment through tax incentives. You do that, the country will boom.
That's a Labour person I'd vote for, I have to say. I wish the Tories had done some of that as well. Brendan Chilton, always a pleasure. I told you, I've got a brace of my favourite Brendans today. Brendan Chilton, Labour councillor, former chair of Labour Leave, also chief executive of the Independent Business Network.